I'm standing in downtown Asheville in Pack Square. Behind me is the Vance Monument, named after Zebulon Vance, a former governor and U.S. congressman who was born just up the road north of here in Weaverville. When the statue was built in 1896, before high-rises dominated the skyline, the 50-foot statue was a towering structure. It was meant to be seen from the distance, something to reflect the far-reaching influence of Zebulon Vance. You see, Zebulon Vance was also a decorated Confederate military officer, and he became one of the most influential Southern leaders of the Civil War and the post-bellum period after the Civil War. He was also a Southern slave owner, and in recent years, controversy has surrounded the celebration of Confederate monuments like this one in public spaces. During the years after the Civil War, Vance and others in his party worked to change the Constitution in racist ways, outlawing interracial marriage and integrated schools, and gave states power over local elections, and thus prevented majority black counties from electing their own leaders. In recent days, as the Black Lives Movement has called out the racial injustices we see happening today, many have called for the monument to be removed from this prominent public space. Did you know that this corner is the site of many protests that happen in Asheville? After the recent death of George Floyd, involving a Minneapolis police officer who pinned Floyd's neck to the ground with his foot, protests demanding justice are taking place nightly right here. The freedom of Americans to express their First Amendment rights to peacefully protest is a great thing. And as people of faith, we are called to speak truth to power. One of the chants that you hear at protests is "No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace." A chant that is based on the biblical idea that if you really want shalom, God's peace in the world, then we must have justice too. The Old Testament prophets and Jesus reminded us that God's concern is first for those who live on the margins, those who are the poor and the oppressed, those who are hungry and forgotten and are in prison. The prophet Amos called for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Such justice and righteousness are needed for us to live in peace with one another. But when systems continue to bring death and injustice to black lives, such as George Floyd, there cannot be peace until there is change. As long as racial inequalities exist in our healthcare system, we will continue to see how our current COVID-19 pandemic will bring death unproportionately to persons of color in our country. Modern-day prophets like Martin Luther King Jr. showed us how nonviolent protests can shine a light to the evils of hatred and oppression. Though some may feel called to speak out in public ways, like standing outside on street corners, holding signs and chanting for justice, others of us may be drawn to working behind the scenes, writing letters to our elected officials, asking them to change the way our laws work. One of the things that we see in the Bible is that the way that God can use unlikely people to be prophets. Some of the Old Testament prophets, like Jeremiah, were very reluctant to step into their roles as prophets. "But Lord, I don't know how to speak. I am too young," said young Jeremiah. And other teenagers like Mary, the mother of Jesus, used their lives and their voices to speak of God's plan for justice and salvation for all. As justice for the planet has become a pressing issue for our day, we have seen unlikely prophets like Greta Thunberg speak up about the urgency to make environmental changes to save our planet. Though we often think about prophets as being people who know and predict things about the future, prophets in the Bible really are people who know how to read the signs of the time today. They have a sense of how sin has messed things up in God's world and how God is inviting us to make a change. When they speak truth to power, Prophets can ignite a movement, as we have seen in the global movement towards environmental justice. But being a prophet is not always about starting large movements. We can all be prophets in our own ways. When we see someone at school bully another person, when someone tells a racist or sexist joke and others laugh or remain silent, we all have a choice. Do we take the chance to speak out or remain silent? Do we choose the way of love that may lead to conflict, or do we lay low and be quiet? Or when we go and volunteer to do service at our local food bank or community garden, are we content to just feel good about what we're doing and get the volunteer hours in? Or are we willing to learn about the root causes of food insecurity in our country? Are we willing to take the time and effort to call our elected officials or email to advocate for budgets that provide funding for people needing food assistance? My prayer for all of you is to remain open to the way that God may be calling you to be a prophet right here and right now. In the words of the prophet Micah, may we all find the courage to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God.
No peace. No peace. No peace. No peace. No peace.